any pretense of neutrality has been out the window, and Trump's war on federal workers effectively continues more than a year into Biden's administration.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Our next guest is Christopher Dols. He is the president of IFPTE Local 98, representing federal employees at the Army Corps in New York. Chris, thanks for taking the time this morning. I appreciate it.
Thank you. It's really good to be here.
Great. So Chris is here to talk about the U.S. Senate's and Chuck Schumer's seeming reluctance, their delay on approving President Joe Biden's nomination to the Federal Labor Relations Authority and the Merit Systems Protection Board. So we've got a lot of folks in the audience who are not federal employees, and even some federal employees are going to be like, what the hell's that? So, Chris, what the hell is that? What are those two agencies?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much again for the opportunity. Folks have probably heard of the National Labor Relations Board, right? That is the federal agency responsible for managing labor relations or, interpreting contracts and resolving disputes related to labor relations in the private sector. Well, the federal sector has its own agency for that same purpose, and that is the Federal Labor Relations Authority. It was created by the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978, and it is the body responsible for governing labor relations in the federal sector for the 2.1 million of us federal employees. So, it's the largest union employer in the country. It's almost the largest employer in the country, second to Walmart. And it's an important sector for a lot of reasons. It's a pace setter. It's, Trump used his influence to try to break the unions in the federal sector. Biden is attempting to use his influence to try to repair some of that damage. Being that it's in the executive branch, it's the most direct influence that a president has in terms of labor relations. And so it serves as a bit of a bellwether for policy, in general, dating back to the PATCO strike in 1981. That was the early days of the Civil Service Reform Act and the early days of the Federal Labor Relations Authority. And it's the way that Ronald Reagan kind of drew the line against labor and set the tone for, I would say, the decades ever since. So Federal Labor Relations Authority is a really important agency for all federal employees. I would say it's important for all Americans because the quality of labor relations in the federal government informs the quality of the service that we provide. And there's obviously many services that we provide the American population. And then very briefly, the Merit Systems Protection Board is another independent agency within the federal government responsible for hearing appeals for any number of personnel actions that may happen in a federal workplace. So if you are fired or you are discriminated against in one way or another, you can have recourse by appealing those decisions up to the Merit Systems Protection Board. It's responsible for upholding the merit principles, which of course are a very important part of civil service. Merit principles are what replaced, old cronyism and favoritism, and it's been in place for more than 100 years. And the nominees that President Biden has sent to the Senate they would give the quorum that the Merit Systems Protection Board needs to do its job. They haven't had quorum in 5 years. That was a deliberate choice by Chuck Schumer's predecessor, Mitch McConnell. He chose not to process Trump's, albeit I'm sure, terrible nominees. He chose not to process them to maintain an absence of quorum in order to make sure that none of these appeals can be heard. So for the past 5 years, a caseload of more than 4,000 appeals have gone unheard. Wow. There's 4,000 caseload backlog. And it's one of the many ways that the small government fundamentalists like Trump and McConnell have sought to undermine the purpose of the federal government. And then at the FLRA, it's a different tactic. They stacked it with anti-labor members. Most importantly, of course, are the two that make up the current majority. That's James Abbott and Colleen Duffy-Kiko. The two of them have, over the course of the last 4+ years, ruled, stepped way outside of what would be reasonable jurisprudence and overturned some 75% of the decisions in front of them, of the arbitrators' decisions in front of them, almost uniformly against unions. Any pretense of neutrality has been out the window, and Trump's war on federal workers effectively continues more than a year into Biden's administration.
Right. That's 4,000 cases in the Merit Systems Protection Board that have not been adjudicated. That is huge. What are the kind of cases, or what are some of the cases that have not been adjudicated that have been? Has it been sort of precedent setting for federal employees that these cases that they're just sitting unanswered?
Yes. I mean, the Merit Systems Protection Board has relative to the FLRA, has a relatively narrow impact with each case. And so the absence of decisions isn't so much setting precedent as just gumming up the works, where the precedent is getting set, which is really dangerous. And it's not just the precedents that were set under Trump's years, but it's ongoing. Every decision coming out of the FLRA is new precedent, and the unions cannot afford to appeal every single one of them to the district court. The ones that they do all get overturned, and thank goodness for those. In fact, Ketanji Brown Jackson is the author of the most recent decision, throwing out a really awful decision by the FLRA that basically changed the obligation of agencies to negotiate changes in conditions of employment. I'll give that example because if you're looking for an example, it's a good one, because part of our talking points around this, and we have an open letter to Chuck Schumer. Chuck Schumer is, our senator here in New York, but he's obviously the majority leader. So in a sense, we're all his constituents. And we are trying to convince him to prioritize these nominations because the precedents are so bad. So just to take this one example, the original Civil Service Reform Act that gave rise to current modern federal labor relations law, it enshrined a compromise between the unions and the agencies. It's a very different compromise than that which enshrined the National Labor Relations Board. But the federal unions gave up a bunch of important things. They have an extremely narrow scope of bargaining. We can't negotiate over wages. We can't negotiate over benefits. We have no right to strike. We're not even allowed to assert the right to strike. So there's a whole raft of restrictions that don't apply to the rest of the privates, to the rest of the labor movement and other American workers. In exchange for those things, federal workers were guaranteed the right to negotiate procedures and arrangements that relate to their conditions of employment. And it's really important when you take the right to strike and the right to assert the right to strike, and you take the right to negotiate wages and benefits, when you take all those things off the table, then what stands is really important to uphold. So what's been happening over the last few years has been the steady chipping away. Trump did it through big executive orders, but also the FLRA majority that's still in place is continuing to chip away. I call it death by 1,000 cuts. And this one most recent decision that was overturned further constricts the scope of bargaining so that no longer are agencies required even to do that little bit we have, which is negotiate procedures and arrangements related to conditions of employment. At least now it becomes the obligation of the union to demonstrate that there's a substantial impact. Previously, they basically had to do it for anything greater than de minimis. And so this all taken together represents a constriction of the rights of federal employees, a reduction in the obligations of agencies to negotiate with them. And fortunately, that one decision was overturned because the unions did appeal it to the district court. But there's many others that haven't been overturned, and it's going to take years to repair, assuming we get an actual neutral body in place, which isn't given because Chuck Schumer, despite having the votes, has failed to prioritize confirming the nominees. So
why is that? Because the Democrats have a 50-50 split in the Senate. There is, Manchin has basically announced that the Build Back Better plan is dead, that he would, prefer American families, the child poverty rate to double than to, continue the child tax credits. So there's very, very little that Democrats can actually do right now. And basically that's limited to, confirming Biden appointees. And they have been moving at a pretty feverish pace for the federal judgeships. Why are these nominations, which, like you said, affect the second largest single group of American workers? That's a lot of people, and the largest set of union workers in the country. Why is Chuck Schumer allowing these nominations to just sit by the wayside?
I can't read Chuck Schumer's mind. I can only speculate. I mean, he's clearly not prioritizing it. So why isn't he prioritizing it? He's had the votes. Like you said, these confirmations aren't the things that Manchin and Sinema are opposing, right? There's no indication that it wouldn't go through. He has the votes. So currently, because Lujan is sick, he may not have the votes right now, but that makes it all the more important that we build the pressure on him to prioritize at the moment Lujan as well, or the moment we convince Murkowski or one of the other moderate Republicans to support, which is something that the unions are doing. But one of the nominees, the most important pressing one, which is Susan Grunman to the FLRA, was out of committee and ready for confirmation in December, and he refused to prioritize it. Why is that? This is speculation, but I think it's safe to say that the Chuck Schumer brand of Democrat isn't as friendly to labor as we might hope. If he were, then the one place that they can have the most direct impact would be one of the many things that he would prioritize. I invite Chuck Schumer to prove me wrong. Show me you're a friend of labor and prioritize these confirmations. Prove to us that the Biden administration, which has been called the best friend American labor has had, in a generation, some say ever, prove that that's true by being his ally in the Senate and actually making these confirming these nominations.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and something that you mentioned to me the other day was, what is the relationship of unions to Democrats worth if we can't even get something like this through? I remember actually back in 2017 when the PRO Act was kind of the litmus test for Democrats. And I remember AFL-CIO President Richard Trumka coming to the Alabama AFL-CIO state convention and threatening to rescind the endorsement for Doug Jones if he didn't co-sponsor it, even though Doug Jones was going to lose anyway, and it wouldn't matter if he co-sponsored it because Republicans had the majority at that time, and Doug Jones had given verbal affirmation to Trumka and our state Fed president that if it came before the House, he would vote for it. He just didn't want to co-sponsor it because of, he thought that I would disagree with him, but he thought that it wouldn't be good for his campaign, even though he was going to lose it anyway. So so like that, it seems to me that like the position of labor as it relates to Democrats has kind of, it's much less aggressive right now when Democrats actually have the power. Like there's some amount of things that Democrats can do for working people in this country. And it does seem like we as a labor movement are more hesitant to speak against, to speak about that than we were when they were not out of power. And I don't know, that's kind of, it's a bug in my bonnet that I've had for a while.
I mean, at risk of going beyond the scope of what I'm here to talk about, I really agree. I think it's a major strategic problem for the labor movement in general. I think that we actually have, in some respects, I think that some of the strategy makers in the labor movement have kind of worked themselves into a riddle that they can't solve because everything is subordinated to the maintenance of the allies they've convinced themselves they have, instead of building independent capital and leverage vis-a-vis all politicians, and through that independence, being willing to call any of them to account. And this alignment, which is perceived and real, of labor in the Democratic Party camp, has led to a situation where we can be taken for granted, where we are not prioritized, where people like Chuck Schumer can prioritize performative losses dying on hills, of his own making in the Senate, because clearly that's what he's prioritized. At least that's what he did in the fall, at the expense of very winnable things like staffing the government with merit systems protectors and the FLRA board that we need.
Yeah, the thing for me, this is Adam jumping in, it just seems like such low-hanging fruit. Mm-hmm. Like, if you want an easy victory to help working people, to help unions, to use authority that you have given a gridlocked government, here you go.
Right.
Just like it's teed up for you. You just got to hit the ball. and they're like, no, we're not going to grab a bat, actually. Right. So, it's very frustrating. I can imagine how frustrating it is for you and your members. But, you kind of opened up with reminding folks, and Jacob just did it as well, largest employer of union folks in the entire country. And so, just like all contracts kind of relate to other contracts, all these fights are interrelated. Concessions draw more concessions, wins build on wins. And, so I definitely want to see this happen. I want to see some progress being made here so that things can get better for our federal union members, which I hope will then, translate to gains elsewhere in the private sector or in, local and state government employees all across the board. So, really appreciate the fight that you're undertaking.
Thanks. If I may, could I just highlight some of the support we've already gotten?
Yeah,
absolutely.
That was actually going to be my next question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Sorry. So I'm at the Army Corps of Engineers in New York, which is obviously under the Department of Defense, which is a massive piece of the federal picture, of course. And we're in New York, so we put out this open letter call. It's drafted. It's posted at acecouncil.org, which is the Army Corps of Engineers Council in IFPTE, which is the International Federation of Professional and Technical Engineers. And just in the last 3 weeks, we decided to put out the call not to the national leaders of AFGE, NTEU, IFPTE, all the other Fed sector unions. We decided to focus on the grassroots and prioritize connecting with other folks like me, local leaders, local presidents, folks with small bargaining units that range from, 100 workers to maybe a couple thousand on the high end. But we're talking about, the Fed sector has more than 1,000, maybe upwards of 2,000 different local unions. And we want to demonstrate to Chuck Schumer that, yes, we are his constituents in New York, but this is not just a constituent issue in New York. It affects everybody. And so we put out a call to, we're making cold calls. We're calling through locals across the country. And we have a growing group of people making these calls to build a network of federal local leaders that will hopefully be the future of the federal sector labor movement. And just to, give some props to some of the folks who have signed on, we have the council at AFGE, Council 238, that represents their national bargaining unit in the Environmental Protection Agency. A couple of Social Security locals have signed on in the South and as well as here in New York. A small local of electricians at the Architects of the Capitol have signed on. A bunch of Army Corps locals have signed on because that's obviously kind of where this whole thing started, including the Mobile district down near you guys, as well as Louisville, Kentucky, Chicago, San Francisco, and Seattle. The MSPB Professional Association, the workers who staff the Merit Systems Protection Board, just signed on. They're our most recent signatory. A small NOAA local in Seattle is part of it. A couple of energy locals out west at the Bonneville Power Authority have signed on. The National Association of Immigration Judges. We're up to 26 different locals that have signed on to the open letter, and we aren't stopping. We're going to keep building out this network, even if we lose and things continue to operate under Trump's rules. At the end of this campaign, we're going to have a new network of federal local leaders that are capable of coordinating action, coming together around common causes, and it'll be a victory in any case. But we hope to also convince Chuck Schumer to get back into the fold and actually do one of the few things he can do easily and staff the MSPB and the FLRA.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on both fronts that hopefully, surely to goodness, this will result in a win, and we will be able to get these agencies, these boards staffed properly, and see some wins for federal workers, and then by proxy, hopefully some wins for non-federal workers. But also, I do think that having a strong network of people that are in the same fights is important. I look forward to bringing this up at my next local meeting. I'm a member of AFGE Local 1858. I look forward to bringing it up at my next local meeting, encouraging us to sign on. I think it's important. I don't think I'll have an issue with that. So, Chris, I thank you very much for your work up there in New York, and for your work putting this campaign together, because it's very important, and so let's hope that it passes.
Thanks so much, Jacob and David. You guys do great work. Really appreciate it. I love listening to your show, and that's exactly the next step we need. So any listeners out there who happen to be federal sector, or if you have any contacts with federal sector locals, this is from the bottom up. So even if you're not a local officer yourself, contact your local officers and say, again, the website is acecouncil.org. That's ACECOUNCIL.org. And you'll see two things on there. One is the letter, which includes the list of current signatories, and that's 26 and growing. And below that is a top 10 worst decisions by the Kiko and Abbott majority, to give you a sense of how bad the FLRA leadership is. So if you're in a federal local, please ask your local leaders to sign on. When we hit 50 or 100, hopefully in the next couple of weeks, I think we'll have a clearly viable campaign that hopefully we can use to pressure the leaders of our internationals to put some resources behind. And then we'll find a splashy way to deliver this letter to Chuck Schumer.
That sounds great. I love splashy displays against politicians. It's one of my favorite things. So speaking my language. Chris, thank you very much for joining the show. I appreciate it.
Thank you, guys. Good work.
All right. That was Christopher Dols, president of IFPTE Local 98 in New York, representing federal employees at the Army Corps of Engineers, talking about a campaign which, like we said, it's just the most, the most common sense kind of thing. There's not very much that Democrats can do, and so they should do what they can. And protecting the rights of the largest union workforce in the country, the second largest workforce period in the country, I think that this is something that Democrats should be doing in the Senate, and it's a shame that they haven't. And we appreciate folks like Chris for putting some pressure on them. Yeah,
it's one of those where really they shouldn't have to embark on this campaign. Right. But I like something that Chris said, though, is they're activating folks and engaging folks along these lines, and that will be cool to see. How many future leaders and activists and organizers inside the unions are going to grow out of this fight? Hopefully a successful fight, but regardless. So I think that's a really cool approach and perspective to bring to it.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.